Hi everyone, this is Jeremy Sporn. I'm the marketing director here over at Pivot Point Security. I'll turn it over to John Very in just a few minutes for the presentation. Just want to give everyone a chance to join in. We'll officially start at 1:01. If you just joined in, we're just giving everyone another minute to hop on. We'll hand over to John Very in just a minute or two. All right. Well, hello everyone and welcome to this webinar, ISO 27001 for 2018, Key Steps to Make Certification a Success. Again, my name is Jeremy and I'm the marketing director here at Pivot Point Security. Before John begins, a few quick logistical items. Questions are absolutely encouraged. This is a session meant to be as valuable as possible, and it only works if you get the information you need. Feel free to send questions while John is presenting. We'll make sure to go through all the questions at the end of the presentation. I'll read them aloud for everyone to hear, and John will address them one at a time. Questions can be typed into the question box, and again, John will answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. If you do run into technical issues during the presentation and think you might miss something important, please don't worry. We are sending a recording of the presentation that you'll get via email, whichever email address you use to sign up for the webinar. We'll also send out a copy of the presentation slide deck itself. Quick note about our presenter. John Very is the managing partner of Pivot Point Security. He has worked with 100 plus of our ISO 27001 certified clients. He's a certified ISO 27001 lead auditor, and believe it or not, a couple people have called him the Brad Pitt of ISO 27001. You'll have to ask him why that is. John, the floor is yours. Go ahead and take it away.
Nice. Thanks for setting me up that way. It's Brad Pitt Fight Club here, and not Moneyball here, for those that are really worried about it.
Sure.
So I'm assuming a number you had ISO 27001 as a New Year's resolution, which is we always see that at the beginning of the year. There's a lot of interest. A lot of people put ISO off. So today's presentation really is to talk about where we are in 2018. A little bit about what it takes to get ISO 27001 certified, what are some of the approaches, and then as Jeremy alluded to, my goal is to give you whatever information that you need to put you in a position to make a good decision, or whether or not you decide to move forward with ISO or not. So realistically, I'm going to leave a lot of time open for questions. If there's something that we don't get to, or there's something that you need to know, you can just hit Pivot Point website, send us an email, or send me an email. I'm John.Very. Happy to answer any questions you might have about ISO and related topics. So some of the, for the most part, right, where we see people moving towards ISO 27001 is you've got some type of a stakeholder that wants to know that you're doing the right thing with their information, right? They want to know you're secure, and they want you to prove it. And ISO 27001 is a phenomenal way of doing that, right? It's a form of third-party attestation, very, very well recognized, very comprehensive framework for managing information-related risk. And what's cool about that is that the issues that you're seeing there, things like NIST 800-171, which is around controls over unclassified information, or if you're being subject to the general data protection regulations or other privacy standards. If you're an insurance company or financial company that's subject to New York State DFS 500. All of those, and we could also layer in HIPAA, and we can layer in Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. One of the wonderful things about ISO 27001 is it's a comprehensive management system that will incorporate all of those issues. What it will do, of course, is hopefully keep you out of the press, right? And keep you from becoming one of those major breaches, of which there's been, a new one nearly every day, right? A remarkably small percentage of our ISO 27001 certified clients experience any issues of note. If you put a comprehensive framework in place, it really does reduce the likelihood of something bad happening. Nothing eliminates risk, but ISO does a really good job of minimizing risk. One of those key risks that we see right now is that phishing and ransomware. One of the things about ISO 27001 is one of the sets of controls that you'll consider during that is security awareness education. So inherently, ISO 27001 is going to manage risk, allow you to be conform with different forms of regulatory compliance, and is going to prove to your stakeholders that you're doing things the right way. So there's two common approaches. One I'll call the optimum way. If I was going to be nasty, I'd call it the right way. And one which is not what I would call optimum, although it can be sometimes necessary, right? So option one, if you're going to do ISO, if you're thinking about going towards ISO, the way that I think you should attack it is the way that the actual standard is built, right? So ISO 27001 is often misunderstood. People think of it as a set of controls that you implement. And while within ISO you do implement a set of controls, ISO 27001 is not about the controls, it's about the management system that allows us to determine which controls we need and how strong those controls should be. And you do that based on risk management, right? So ISO is a risk management framework that helps you pick which controls and how strong they should be. So ideally, what you would do is build the management system first, right? And I'll talk about what a management system is in a second. Once you've got the management system built, then what we can do is the management system will have said, these are the controls that you should implement to mitigate risk to a level that you've deemed acceptable. At that point, what I think the best way to handle this is to then gap assess the controls in your environment against the controls that the management system said you should have, identify those gaps, close the gaps, and you're prepared to be certified, right? So that's an idealized approach. Option two, I'll call that the cart before the horse, is let's look at the controls first. How far am I right now? Close those gaps, circle back, implement the management system. But what happens is, because the management system is what rationalizes the controls, when you get done with the management system, you're going to need to revisit whether or not those are the right controls, and make sure that the ones you chose and the way that you chose to implement them match up with the management system. So it's a little less efficient. There are times I think that it is the right approach, right? So as an example, one of the decisions you'll make if you're moving towards ISO 27001 is, are you going to work with a consulting firm, someone like Pivot Point Security, to help you implement ISO 27001, or are you going to do it yourself? We call it a roll your own. If you're going to do a roll your own and you don't yet have management system expertise, starting with those controls might not be a terrible approach, right? Yes, you might have some more work to do, but it's going to put you in a position where you can make consistent and steady progress, which is another reason why sometimes option two is a good approach, right? Is if you've got a poor information security control environment and you've got either risk that you're concerned about, or you've got clients that are concerned about your risk, then you need to do something, you need to do something fast. And sometimes implementing the technical controls mitigates the most risk in the shortest period of time. So under that scenario, you tell me you want to do option two, I totally get it. There's a third time we see people go towards option two that I I don't think really is a good choice, but although a lot of people choose to do it. That is that they don't know how far they are, so they do that to measure the gap and then use that to go to management to get their budget and to set timeline. I don't think it's effective because often when you measure the gap, you're measuring the technical control gap on what you presume you need to implement, and you miss the management system control gap, which is often fairly significant. And sometimes the gap in the controls isn't what you think it is. So I think sometimes you end up with non-optimized answers to go back to management with. I think if you chatted with someone really intelligent on ISO, you can probably get to a better answer with no work, and then at least have the option of going towards option one, which is the better approach. So we talked about ISO as being, this confusion about it being a set of technical controls. So let's talk about that really briefly, right? So ISO 27001 is the recipe for an information security management system. If you picked up a copy of ISO 27001 and you peel away the forward and the blurbage on the front, you peel off the list of technical controls in the back, which is what they call Annex A. The meat of ISO 27001 is only about 10 or 12 pages, right? And that is what's referred to as the 7 clauses of ISO 27001. That's the management system that we build. It's the set of processes that are used for an organization to understand the information that they want to protect and build a plan to protect it. And have that plan and that approach be certifiable by an independent, objective third party who can come in and conduct an audit and issue you a certificate. That's a form of third-party attestation. That's the strongest form of attestation that you can have to hand to somebody else to say, yep, we're doing things the right way. So that's the management system component. The second part of that is the technical controls. In the back of ISO 27001 is something called Annex A. It's a listing of the 14 domains of ISO and the 114 controls within ISO. That defines the technical controls that you'll use to mitigate the risks that you determine in your management system. So if you think about controls as being mechanisms that reduce risk, that's going to make understanding ISO 27001 and any management system much easier, right? Because the question becomes, well, why do I need a control? Because I have that risk. Or why don't I need a control? Because I don't have that risk. And then why did I implement the control to that extent? Because my risk was very large, so I put a stronger control in place. So that's the idea of the technical controls. Annex A is a very shorthand listing of those 114 controls. If you want more detail, you'll find that in a document referred to as ISO 27002. So an ISO 27001 management system consumes the controls listed in ISO 27002 to manage risk in accordance with your risk appetite. And that's a really, really important part about ISO. One of my favorite things about ISO is non-prescriptive. So what that means is ISO is not going to tell you how long your passwords need to be. ISO is not going to tell you that you need two-factor authentication or that you don't. ISO is not going to tell you you need password vaulting or that you need to encrypt data at rest. ISO for every single control is going to say, based on your specific context, right? Your particular organization, your particular risks, and your particular risk appetite, implement a control which is reasonable and appropriate to your situation, right? So that's really the benefit of ISO when you compare it with, let's say, NIST guidance. NIST guidance, excellent. The people from NIST put out phenomenal guidance. The challenge with NIST is it tends to be more prescriptive, and very often we have to implement controls because NIST said we need to, versus because we think we need them. ISO allows you to implement the controls that you believe are necessary to mitigate risk to a level that you're comfortable with. So let's really quick talk about that management system, because this is something that confuses a lot of people, right? It's a foreign concept, right? So these are the 7 clauses of ISO 27001, and if you follow them logically, it is, in my opinion, one of the better ways to actually go about implementing ISO 27001, right? So the first thing that we need to agree on is scope, right? And in ISO's world, we call that context, right? What is it that we're protecting? So what information are we trying to protect and why, okay? And when we begin to understand what information we're trying to protect, one of the ways that we understand risk in context is you can think about it in flows, right? So how does that data get to me? How does that data live within my organization? How does it leave my organization? What are the processes that act on that data? What are the systems and physical and geographic locations that are integral to those processes? What are the databases, systems, networks, applications, data centers? Who are the vendors that have access to that data, right? What are the client and contractual obligations that I might have to that data? What are the laws and regulations that apply to that data? Who are the people that have an interest in us doing a good job of treating that data appropriately, whether it's our customers, whether it's my board, whether it's my leadership, whether it's my cyber liability insurance provider, whether it's a regulator for my industry, right? All of those are around context, right? What's the big picture of understanding anything that influences information-related risk and the decisions that I make about how to treat that risk? Once I understand that, we call that in ISO's world scope. ISO 27001 scope. And you will actually produce in ISO a document that defines all that information. It's called the scope statement, right? Once we understand that context, right, then what we need to do is make sure that we've defined the responsibility, right? Leadership has defined the responsibility to ensure that that happens, right? Who are the people in the organization that are responsible for it? What is the structure of the processes that we're going to use to govern it? We're going to have a risk management committee. We're going to have an information security management system committee, a 27001 steering committee. How you structure this, right? How are we going to put the right people in place, right? And task them with the responsibility to manage the risk that we've identified within that context. And then the next step is planning, right? So what is the plan that we have to manage that risk, right? How and why did we arrive at that particular plan? What's really cool about ISO is that if you look at an ISO environment, right, and you can trace why particular controls are in place through the system to understand why that particular control is implemented to that particular level. And that's done through, and planning is largely around risk management, right? So under planning, you're going to do something like establish what we refer to as a risk methodology. How is it that we're going to consistently and repeatably measure and assess risk, right? So what are the impact criteria that we're going to consider? Is it loss of customers? That is the way that we measure risk, or is it loss of revenue, lost productivity, legal action, fines? How is it that you think about risk in your organization? And then as we look at each potential risk to information, right, we measure that risk against that impact criteria. We think about what the probability is of that occurring, and then we determine whether or not that risk, whether it's graded as high, medium, or low, or very high, or if you put a number to it, it's 83 on a scale of 100. ISO doesn't care how you do it as long as you do it consistently and repeatedly. And repeatedly is good too, by the way. So once you have that risk framework built, how are we going to execute that and make good decisions on what is and what isn't acceptable risk? By the way, within ISO, top management has to be, and that's in quotes, you can't see my air quotes, that is what's defined in the standard, that top management has to be involved in establishing what we refer to as acceptance risk criteria, you might call it risk appetite, in telling you, whoever's governing the operation of the information security management system, that what risk is or isn't acceptable, right? And then we implement a plan to mitigate those risks that are not yet acceptable, right? Once we understand all that risk, right, well, we need to make sure that we understand the resources that we need to commit to making this plan a reality, right? Resources are funding, resources are personnel, resources are competency of that personnel, right? So that's where management commits that support to the system. The system has to operate. Who's going to do that? How, when, where? What do those processes look like? How often do risk assessments happen? What happens if threats change mid-year? What happens if the information that we're processing changes? When we bring on a new customer or we take on a new type of a project, right? Does that change risk? Does that change the scope of our ISMS? Does that change the controls that we should have in place to manage that risk, right? So that's all around the operation. It's also around the things that you'd expect it to be around, more the technical control environment. How do we manage physical security? Who's reviewing video access logs? User account management reviews, configuration management, and vulnerability and patch management operation, right? All that gets covered under that operation, and management's responsibility is to ensure that it's defined and that it operates. Knowing something operates is not the same thing as knowing that it's effective. And ISO requires that you build into your management system the necessary performance evaluation steps to ensure the effectiveness of the information security management system. The two most common ways that that's done, within ISO, you will have security metrics. And what the security metrics should be is something that you're measuring the effectiveness of you achieving the plan and the objectives laid out in the plan. So a good example might be that in your plan, during your risk assessment, you determine that you've got an unacceptably high level of risk associated with vendor or third-party risk management, right? You're not doing a good job yet of assessing vendors, and those vendors have access to high-risk data, right? So in your plan, you might, and in your risk treatment plan, based on mitigating that risk to a level which is acceptable, you might be implementing stronger vendor risk management controls. Let's say you're doing reviews, you're sending out questionnaires, you're gathering data from them, and you're verifying their security posture, right? So in your security metrics, what you might have is a control that would measure the percentage of high-risk vendors that have gone through the program. And you might set that target to 75% for this year, right? So that's security metrics. It might also be things like percentage of our employees that have gone through our security awareness education program, right? Whatever it is that's high risk and we should measure to make sure that we're doing what we think we're doing, that's performance evaluation. The other way you do performance evaluation in an ISO 27001 management system is you are responsible each year to conduct what's referred to as an internal ISMS audit. So you need to conduct an audit that looks at the operation of the management system and the key controls of the management system, technical controls that is, and it ensures the effectiveness of their operation. That internal audit then will, you'll identify what we refer as non-conformities, think of them as findings or deficiencies in the operation of your management system, and you will find, I don't care how good your environment is, there's always things that break down, right? So the way ISO handles that is you have something called corrective action planning procedures. You'll have a policy that says, hey, when we have a breakdown in our management system, we put a corrective action plan in place that identifies the root cause of that problem and drives the resolution of the issue. So coming out of your audit, you'll put some caps in place, corrective action plans in place to address those issues. And then once you've gotten through the audit, you will be ready for your certification audit in year 1, or what we call surveillance audits in year 2 and year 3. ISO works in 3-year cycles. Those caps are part of an improvement process, which is also required by ISO. So one of the reasons you also manage performance is what you need to demonstrate year over year is that you've improved the effectiveness of your information security management system. So a good way to do that is those metrics, right? So in year 1, I get through 70% of my high-risk vendors. By year 2, I'm through 90%. And then in year 3, maybe I'm through 100% of my high risk and 20% of my medium risk, right? That would be a good way to show an auditor you've improved. Or maybe if you were talking about patch management, maybe your mean time to close critical vulns on Windows servers in your environment is 30 days. Maybe in the next year, you bring that down to 20 days or 21 days, right? Good example of how we demonstrate improvement. So this is the management system component, right? Not very unlike the next component. And why you're not advancing? Okay. The controls within ISO. So remember, the management system allows us to determine and rationalize which controls we need and how strong they should be. These are the controls that you implement within ISO, right? And they're the controls you probably are all very familiar with, right? You've got operational security controls that are around what I would refer to as traditional technical security, you know, vulnerability and configuration management, controls over malware, desktop IPS, backup logging, reviews, things of that nature, right? You've got your communications security domain, which deals with largely network security related stuff. The A14 deals with what they refer as acquisition, development, maintenance. You can think of that as your security development lifecycle methodology, right? How do we know that as we implement systems and new applications, we're doing so in a way which will yield a secure result? 15 we talked about a lot. That's supplier relationships. You can think of that as vendor risk management. You can also think of that as third-party risk management. But within ISO, you need to make sure that those suppliers that have access to your critical data, they understand those risks, you understand the risk associated with them, and that you've ensured that they've implemented sufficient controls to manage that risk in a manner which you're comfortable with, right? 16 is around incident management. Think about that as your incident response plan. 17 is around business continuity management. It's interesting, within ISO 27001, you don't actually have to have a full-fledged business continuity management plan. You have to have a business continuity management component that ensures the information security in the event of a disruption, right? The continuity of the information security management system in that case, right? ISO is a very comprehensive standard, so it touches on things that we don't often refer to or think of as directly IT. We've already touched on vendor risk management. Compliance is around legal and contractual requirements, right? And the requirement to do information security reviews, right? So during an ISO engagement, we're working with your legal team, we're working with your procurement and contractual team, right? Because we need to understand what are the laws and regulations that govern the operation of the data, right? Which is risk to you. And also, what are your clients either contractually obligating you to now, or what are some of the contractual obligations you see on the horizon that we need to account for? Okay, so we have the management system, which drives the selection of the technical controls. How does that all look if we were going to put this together in a nice package, right, and tie it up with a bow, right? If you were going to implement ISO 27001 in an idealized way, what would it look like? I think this is the way it looks, and this is the way that we do it, right? The first and foremost thing is that you can't understand risk until you understand information that needs to be protected and context, right? What is the issues that affect that risk, right? We talked about this. That's the systems that touch it. That's the data centers and geographic locations, critical vendors, laws and regulations, contractual obligations, cyber liability insurance providers, management's expectations, right? So that's what that scope is. Now, once we understand scope, right, then what we need to do is agree on how are we going to measure the risk to that information given that scope, right? So that's, what does my methodology look like? Conducting my risk assessment using that methodology, building a risk treatment plan, right, that says this is the way that we treat these risks, right? Most of those risks are probably going to be being treated pretty well. Some of them are probably not yet there, right? They'll be unacceptably high, and you'll put a risk treatment plan in place to mitigate those as well. And that combination of the risks that are being treated well already and the risks that require additional treatment, they form what I call a target state, right? If we were doing all of these things, if these controls were all operating this way, we'd be golden, right? That's our target state. Well, let's gap assess that against where you really are right now, right? So once we understand that gap, right, what we can then do is put together what we call a prioritized gap remediation plan. And of course, logically, that's going to have some combination of things you need to do in your management system and things you need to do in your technical controls. And once we've executed that gap remediation plan, we're prepared for that ISMS internal audit that we talked about. You'll conduct that ISMS internal audit. Remember, that's management's way of validating the effectiveness of the information security management system. If we have corrective action plans necessary, which you should, you implement the corrective action plans. You take that through management review, which is a requirement of the standard, and you're prepared for stage one of your certification audit. Stage one is an unusual audit if you haven't been through one. It's not a conventional controls audit. It is an audit where you sit in a conference room with just the documentation for your management system. And the ISO auditor will go through those 12 pages or so, the clauses, literally on a line-by-line or phrase-by-phrase basis, and ask you to demonstrate or explain to him how your management system achieves that standard. So as an example, the standard says that you need to consider the impact of confidentiality, integrity, and availability when we consider risk. So they'll say, explain to me how your risk methodology accounts for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you'll point him to the documentation within your environment, whether it's the risk methodology, whether it's the risk methodology and your risk assessment, methodology, risk assessment, and risk treatment plan, whatever are the components in your environment that will give him the information for him to understand that you're actually achieving that criteria. So once you get through your stage 1 certification audit, in a perfect world, you get through stage 1 without any nonconformities. If you have a major nonconformity, that's really bad. That can impact timeline and your schedule. A minor, not too many minors, they're not ideal, but they're not a big deal. A minor nonconformity is acceptable. What the auditor will do is identify any minor nonconformities, and you'll actually put a corrective action plan in place between stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 and stage 2 are usually separated by about 2 to 6 weeks. So after stage 1, if there are any necessary corrective action plans, you'll put them in place, and the auditor will recommend that you move to stage 2. They'll come back, let's say it's 4 to 6 weeks later, they come back for stage 2. That is going to be the audit that you guys are really comfortable with and familiar with. That's a technical controls audit. Show me evidence of your security awareness education program. Give me signed non-disclosures from 7 out of your 103 employees. I'd like a firewall log from this day. I'd like to see an Active Directory GPO screenshot, right? Very conventional technical controls audit. They'll observe the physical security in your environment, those types of things. So that, at a real quick level, that's ISO. That's some of the confusion around it. That's why people are doing it, right? Key questions for you to ask yourself. The biggest thing is going to be, can I do this myself? Can I do it myself usually has 2 components. Do I have the bandwidth and do I have the expertise, right? If you have the bandwidth and the expertise, you should stand it up yourself. Right? No doubt about it. Where people like us come into play is when you're lacking in one of those 2. The second question people often ask is, should we do this, right? And honestly, I look at ISO 27001 as being a business question as to whether or not you should do it. ISO is not inexpensive, right? ISO costs money to get certified. ISO costs money to maintain. There's some overhead to running and living in an ISO 27001 environment, right? So we've got to balance off is that cost, right, justified based on, some other return on investment? Usually for most organizations, it's going to be around clients lost, clients gained, reducing breach exposure, and things of that nature. So, we're a small company. We're, between 25 and 30 people. We're ISO 27001 certified. Why are we ISO 27001 certified? Because people like you, our potential clients, said, if you're not ISO 27001 certified, we really don't want to give you our data. So I think that's usually, and the vast majority of our clients, we do a lot of work in the verticals that you'd expect that people are asked for proof they're secure. We do a lot of work in law firms, e-discovery firms, software as a service, data center services providers, and things of that nature. And then the last thing that you probably should think about is the timing right. If you've got a lot of other initiatives, not a good time to start ISO. ISO is, it's involved. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of work to do with ISO. You can work with a third party and farm out a lot of that work, but you don't want to farm out too much of the work, because if you do, you end up building a management system and building controls that are that auditor, that consultant's opinion of what your system should look like, and it might not reflect what you think it should look like, your corporate culture, your DNA, the way you actually do things, the way you rationalize things. And you end up living in someone else's environment, which is really uncomfortable, and you tend to be reliant on them. So if you're going to use a third party, try to find what I always call the Goldilocks approach, that kind of just right approach, where you're leveraging them to help you because you don't have the bandwidth or expertise, let's say, but that you're integral to all the key decisions. So that way, when you get done and at the end of the process, there's been the necessary knowledge transfer that you'll be able to operate the management system without being reliant on them. Further, it's going to be a very comfortable environment because it really reflects who you are and how you do things. So with that, Jeremy, hopefully you've been gathering up some questions.
I have, yes. And if anyone hasn't typed in a question yet, feel free to do so. I have a few that have come in, so we'll start at the top. This one is around timeline. I know you touched on this, John, but how long does it typically take a company to go from non-certification to certification if they're starting from the beginning?
Sure. Every answer starts with it depends, but I would say on average, our clients, bulk of our clients right now are probably going through the process in 10 to 12 months. You can do it shorter. Fastest we've ever gotten anyone ISO certified is about 4.5 months, but I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. So I would say fast is 6 or 7 months, and that can be painful and disruptive. So you don't do that unless you need to, unless you're going to lose a big client or something of that nature. 10 or 12 months tends to be reasonably comfortable and not too disruptive. Many of our clients take a little bit longer than that, but they've got a lot of other priorities that they're moving forward at the same time.
Perfect. Quick logistical answer. The recording will be sent out tomorrow to anyone who registered. So everyone will have that by tomorrow. The slide deck might take 1 or 2 extra days, but if you don't have it tomorrow, you'll have it by early next week. John, the next question came in around cost. Traditional costs for an organization for ISO certification is about what?
Well, yeah, great question, right? Because you can be a 5-person company operating out of a single office, or you could be we've got clients, let's say in the legal vertical, that are that have thousands of people across 30 locations around the world, right? So the numbers will vary a bit, but let me give you a kind of a general framework, and then people can kind of build off of that, right? There's 2 costs to getting ISO certified, right? There's one cost which is non-negotiable. You need to undergo an audit. Pivot Point is talking to you. We're consultants, right? We're an optional cost. You don't need us. You don't have a choice with what they call the registrar. They're the entity that conducts the ISO 27001 certification audit. So if you are an organization that is largely centered around a single headquarters, maybe you've either got your data center co-located with you in your facility, or let's say you've got your main data center, which is in a name brand, well-regarded data center co-location facility. Your audit costs might be, certification costs will vary quite a bit depending upon the registrars that you get proposals from. Let's give you a range of, let's say, $17,000 to $30,000 in year 1. Big difference there is some auditors interpret the standard a little bit different, do a little bit more audits. Some organizations charge more because they hire and maintain their own auditors, where others will just go out in the field and grab one. And there's different audit experiences based on that. And there's not a right or wrong. You'll get a certificate from either one of them. The certificates say the same thing. They have the same value, just a different type of a trip that you'll get. So that's a cost we can't do anything about. By the way, that's year 1. That's the certification audit, 3-year cycle ISO. So what happens is in year 2 and year 3, that same auditor will come back and they'll do what they call a surveillance audit, which is a checkup audit. It's not the full audit from year 1. Because of that, the audit costs less. Usually, depending upon how the auditor structures their payments, it's between 50 and 70% of year 1. So let's say, for sake of argument, that you were at 24 grand in year 1. You'd probably be around 16 grand in year 2, 16 grand in year 3, and then it starts over, right? So 24, 16, 16, 24, 16, 16, until we're all pushing up daisies. One last thing, as your organization gets broader, okay, your certificate can apply to your whole organization, but there's also another part of your scope, which is where the auditor goes to verify the scope. Most people certify one location, despite the fact that they might have multiple locations, right? Saying that, so if I'm a law firm, let's say as an example with 12 offices, right? My certificate might read the global ISMS encompassing all my offices, and the audit locations have been, and it lists just your headquarters, which means that's the only office that the auditor went to and observed the operation. So, and that's a very effective and good way of doing it. Sometimes your clients will say, I want to see my office listed on the certificate, which means you'll have to pay a little additional during those audits for the auditor to go to those locations. So that might add to your scope and cost.
Perfect. So a follow-up question to the cost part. Are there any startup or hidden costs? I know you touched upon the registrar cost, but is that the only mandatory cost that people can expect, or is there anything that's sort of hidden or even to enter into it?
No mandatory cost, yes, the registrar. The optional cost that a lot of people do, and that's why Pivot Point exists and we're in business, is that a lot of people don't have the bandwidth or expertise or some combination thereof right now to get certified, but they need to. So there is the option that you use consultants like us to help you. Consultant costs can vary quite a bit, of course, depending upon if you use a company like us that's ISO certified, lots of certified people. We tend to be more expensive than a freelance guy that you might get off the street. So the cost can be all over the board. Plus, it's how much of the work are you going to do versus how much you're going to farm out. If you are a software as a service company, as an example, typical cost, if you work with a consultant and you use them the way most of them do, you're really busy, you're going to use them as much as you can without, the Goldilocks approach. You can assume probably somewhere between, 40 and 80,000, 80% of our clients would be between 40, 50, and $80,000 worth of consulting. On the front side, then you got that certification cost. That can go down if you do a lot of the work yourself. That could go up if you are a multinational organization. Like we did a semiconductor manufacturing organization with manufacturing facilities in 5 countries. Obviously, it costs more there.
Perfect. All right. So we have a specific example. When you have a parent company that's a separate legal entity that is responsible for most of your IT security, and you're a branch office that is mainly responsible for sales and marketing, should you have your own ISO certification or work with your parent company to be part of the certification? And again, in this case, they're separate legal entities.
So separate legal entities, right now there's some challenges with ISO with putting they're trying to figure this out, is how do you, right now, the certificate aligns with the legal entities in most instances, right? So I would say most of the time the way that we see that done would be that you would, as the sub-entity, you would take your certificate. There are advantages and disadvantages to being under somebody else's certificate, and there are advantages and disadvantages from both entity sides. The biggest concern I see with most organizations is they don't want a failure at the other entity to impact their certificate, right? So if you've got 20 customers and suddenly your upstream parent has a problem with the certificate, it impacts your certificate because it's only one certificate. Now you're losing business. So most of the time what I see is organizations do that as 2 separate certificates. But you would have the option of doing it as one certificate, but it would be under one company name as the current construct exists. I know that ISO is talking about ways to kind of figure that out in case somebody wanted to do it in the way that the person's referring to.
Perfect. Another question that came in was around other frameworks like SOC 2 and HITRUST. Should I consider other frameworks other than ISO 27001?
Yes, you should. The answer to your question is not my answer. It's the stakeholder who you are initiating this process for, right? Most organizations don't wake up one morning and suddenly say, I had the epiphany, I want to get ISO certified, right? Most of the time people are getting ISO certified because they want to give that certificate to somebody. So whoever you're going to give your certificate to, or the attestation to, the proof that you're secure to, they're asking you for it. What are they asking you for? So if every one of your customers is asking you to get SOC 2 attested, despite the fact that I'm going to tell you, in my humble opinion, ISO 27001 is the more robust, better, more widely accepted standard, you should get SOC 2 certified, right? Because that's satisfying the demands of the stakeholders that you're providing the assurance to. So I always look at that and say, okay, if it's your customers that are driving you to this decision, what are they asking you for? If there's a clear message, that's what you should do. If the message is muddled, right? Some people are saying SOC 2, some people are saying CSA stars, some people are saying NIST cybersecurity framework, then you got to rationalize and think things through. In that circumstance, I would argue usually ISO 27001 is a great choice because of the international acceptance, the fact that it is a superset of most of those other standards. In fact, most of those other standards many of those other standards, like HITRUST as an example, are based on ISO. They're a derivative. CSA stars is a derivative which is designed to augment an ISO 27001 certificate. Last point there, you may end up getting ISO 27001 and SOC 2, or ISO 27001 and STARS. You might do that for one of two reasons. You've got two sets of clients. They won't budge. One wants one wants the other. Or what you'll find is that it becomes a strategic marketing differentiator. We've got clients that have come to us, got ISO 27001 certified. Their competitor got ISO 27001 certified. They stopped winning those sales because they had a differentiator. Now they get SOC 2 certified to differentiate themselves again. So it's not uncommon that we see both.
Perfect. All right, so we're right up against the 45-minute mark. And it looks like we've gotten through all the questions that were asked. If anyone has any follow-up questions they don't feel were answered, like we said, we'll be sending out an email with the recording of this presentation as well as the slide deck. Definitely appreciate all the nice comments people are sending in, and we really do appreciate the time. Yep.
Hey, Jared, the other thing too is if someone's got a question, they can shoot you an email, right? We're happy to respond via an email. If you had some people don't like to ask questions because they're unique to their situation. Please feel free to reach out via email. If you'd like to arrange a phone call with myself or somebody else on our team, happy to chat and answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, John. And just so everyone knows, it's important that we talk to John over the phone. He does have a face for radio, which is why we keep him on webinars.
That goes against the Brad Pitt comment, doesn't it? Which way is it, Jeremy?
We had to balance you out at some point. That's just how things work. Right? So, but really do appreciate all the nice comments. John, thank you for the time. And like John said, if anyone has any follow-up questions, we're here to answer them.
All right, guys. Thank you, everyone.